So this is part 3 of the introduction. At the location that says taking charge. So you have OCD. What can you and your doctor do to make those awful urges and compulsions go away? The core message in treating OCD is this: do not make the mistake of waiting passively for the ideas and urges to go away. A psychological understanding of the emotional content of the thoughts and urges will rarely make them disappear. Succumbing to the notion that you can do nothing else until the thought or the urge passes is the road to hell. Your life will degenerate into one big compulsion. Think of the analogy of the insistent car alarm that annoys you while you are trying to read a novel or magazine. No matter how annoyed you are not going to sit there and say to yourself, I'm going to make that alarm turn off, and I'm not even going to try to read this until it does. Rather, you're going to do your best to ignore it, work around it. You're going to put your mind back where you want it and do your reading as well as you can. You'll become so absorbed in what you're doing that you'll hardly notice the alarm. So by focusing your attention on a new task, what would otherwise be extremely annoying and bothersome can be worked around and ignored. Because OCD is a medical condition, albeit a fascinating one, and is related to the inner workings of the brain, only a change in the brain itself, or at least in the brain chemistry, will bring about lasting improvement. That is very hopeful of an idea and theory. You can make these changes through behavior therapy alone, or in some cases behavior therapy in combination with medication, certainly. However, medication is only a water wings approach to OCD therapy. It will help you stay afloat while you learn to swim through the rough waters of OCD. At UCLA, medication is used only to help people help themselves. But the underlying principle is the more behavioral therapy you do and the more you apply the 4-step method, the less medication you'll need. Okay. All right. This is especially true over the long haul. Behavioral therapy is discussed in detail in Chapter 8 and medication in Chapter 9. In developing a new approach to treating people with OCD, our research team thought that if we could make patients understand that a biochemical imbalance in the brain was causing their intrusive urges, they may take a different look at their need to act on those urges and strengthen their resolve to fight them. A new method of behavioral therapy might result. To help patients understand this chemical imbalance, we showed them pictures of their brains at work. During the study of brain energy activity in people with OCD, my colleague Dr. Lou Baxter and I took some high-tech pictures using positron emission tomography, PET scan, or PET scanning, in which a very small amount of a chemically labeled glucose-like substance is injected into a person and traced in the brain. The resulting pictures clearly indicated that people with OCD, the use of energy is consistently higher than is normal in the orbital cortex, the underside of the front of the brain. Thus, the orbital cortex, in essence, is working overtime, literally heating up. Figure 1 opposite shows a PET scan presented in color on the cover of this book of a typical OCD patient. Note the high energy use in the orbital cortex compared to a person who does not have OCD. We already knew that by using the behavioral therapy, we could make real and significant changes in how people cope with their urges. Perhaps we reasoned we could not use these visual, striking pictures of the brain to help inspire people with OCD, since a brain problem appeared to be causing their intrusive urges. Strengthening their will to resist the urges might actually change their brain chemistry, in addition to improving their clinical condition. In a bit, I'm going to show you the image that they have here to show the brain and the OCD versus the normal brain and what it looks like. Benjamin, a 41-year-old administrator in a large school district whose brain photos are pictured later in Figure 3, suffered from a compulsive, time-consuming need to have everything in his environment clean and orderly to an abnormal degree. He recalls vividly having his brain photographed and then being shown proof that it was overheating. "Boy, that was a real jolt," he said. It was very distressing to learn that I had a brain disorder, that I wasn't perfect. Initially, it was very difficult to accept. At the same time, seeing the picture was critical to his understanding that he had OCD. In his words, "incontrovertible evidence that I had a brain disorder." In our program at UCLA, Benjamin mastered the 4 steps of cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive biobehavioral self-treatment, and today, 6 years later, his symptoms are largely under control and he is functioning well, both professionally and in his personal relationships. Okay. So I'm going to show you the Figure 1 PET scan showing increased energy use in the orbital cortex and the underside of the front of the brain in a person with OCD. The drawings show where the orbital cortex is located inside of the brain or inside of the head, and the arrows point at the orbital cortex. So the location where the brain slice is taken, the orbital cortex. They show an image of normal control brain and an obsessive compulsive brain, and they show the orbital cortex of those brains in this image. This is the one with obsessive compulsive disorder, and this one is the one that is a normal brain and normal orbital cortex. And there is a picture of this in the back of the book as well, right here. And it shows both images, one that's obsessive compulsive and the other one that's normal. And they show the activity and the heating up of the orbital cortex, and basically showing the overworkings of the brain and what it looks like in OCD versus normal. So that is pretty cool that you can see that on a picture or on an x-ray. If you can see that, that's awesome. So it's a good thing that they could do this. Understanding the difference between the form of OCD urges and their content is the first step towards understanding that brain malfunction is the main culprit in these urges. Remember Barbara and her obsessive worry about Mr. Coffee? She was being driven to distraction, worrying whether she'd turn off that machine. That was the content of her obsession. Superficially, that was her problem. But in treatment, it soon became obvious to her and to us that the real problem was that she couldn't rid herself of the feeling that Mr. Coffee might still be on. She was plagued by the worry hundreds, even thousands of times a day. Gave us an important clue to the mystery of OCD. She could have had that all-consuming worry even while holding the unplugged cord from Mr. Coffee in her hand. That is very relatable, because I could be looking at a room that has absolutely nothing in it and still worry to see if there's anything in that room. It could be empty, completely empty, but I'll still have a feeling to see, is there anything in there? Did I leave anything in there? Is it completely empty and I have no belongings or objects in that room? Is it completely empty? You know, having those questions and worry in your brain while seeing that the room is completely empty will still be playing. The worries will still be playing in an OCD brain. So very much relatable there. Likewise, Brian knew that a brand new battery was not going to leak acid. Still, if someone placed a battery on his desk, he freaked out. The kid who worked with me said he saw guys under fire in Vietnam who didn't have the fear in their faces that I had. And Dottie knew that her son was not going to go blind if she didn't perform a certain compulsion. But if she happened to see a TV show about a person who was blind, she'd have to jump in the shower, clothes and all. What really worried Barbara, Brian, and Dottie was how they could be so worried about something so ridiculous. We will probably never know why Barbara became fixated on Mr. Coffee, and Brian on battery acid, or Dottie on eyes. Fred's theories may provide clues, yet Fred himself believed that these types of problems stem from constitutional factors, by which he meant biological causes. Today, most psychiatrists in the Freudian tradition acknowledge that understanding the psychological content of these symptoms, the deeper inner conflicts that lead one person to worry about causing a fire and another to fear that he or she will do something violent to someone, will do little, if anything, to make the symptoms go away. Why not? Because the core of the problem in OCD lies in its form, in the fact that worrisome feeling intrudes repeatedly into the mind and will not go away. The culprit is a neurological imbalance in the brain. So there is therapy and then a lot of programs that help stabilize and change the neurological imbalance in the brain. But also with it, there is medication. So the medication can help the neurological imbalance in the brain, and as long as you're taking the medication and doing therapy alongside with it together, it's a very helpful plan and a helpful treatment to help neurological imbalance to become reduced or better in the brain of OCD. Once people understand the nature of OCD, they are better armed to carry out the behavioral therapy that leads to recovery. Just knowing it's not me, it's my OCD is a stress reliever that enables them to focus more effectively on getting well. From time to time, we remind them that they are not just pushing a rock to the top of a hill, only to have it roll back down again and again. They're actually changing the hill. They are changing their brains. Okay, now we're going to look at it's what you do that counts. The brain is an incredibly complicated machine whose function is to generate feelings and sensations that help us communicate with the world. When it works correctly, it is easy to assume that it is me. But when the brain starts sending false messages that you cannot readily recognize as false, as happens with OCD, havoc can ensue. This is where mindful awareness and the ability to recognize these messages as false can help. We learn from OCD patients that everyone has the capacity to use the power of observation to make behavioral corrections in the face of the brain's false and misleading messages. It's like listening to a radio station that's jammed with static. If you don't listen closely, you may hear things that are misleading or make no sense. But if you make an effort to listen closely, you will hear things that casual listeners misses entirely, especially if you've been trained to listen. Properly instructed in what to do in the face of confusing messages, you can find reality in the midst of chaos. I like to say, it's not how you feel, but what you do that counts. Because when you do the right things, feelings tend to improve as a matter of course. But spending too much time being overly concerned about uncomfortable feelings, and you may never get around into doing what it takes to actually improve. Focus your attention on the mental and physical actions that will improve your life. That's the working philosophy of this book and the path to overcoming brain lock. The 4 steps are not a magic formula. By calling an urge what it is, by relabeling it, you cannot immediately make it go away. Excessive wishful thinking about immediate recovery is one of the biggest causes of failure, especially at the start of treatment. The goal here is not to make obsessive thoughts simply disappear. They won't in the short run, but rather to be in control of your responses to them. The behavioral therapy guidelines you will learn while doing the 4 steps will help you remember this crucial principle. You will gain control and change your brain mainly by using your new knowledge and to mentally organize your behavioral responses, and by learning to say, that's not me, that's my OCD. The key to remember is this. Change the behavior, unlock your brain. Key points to remember. OCD is a medical condition that's related to a biochemical imbalance in the brain. Obsessions are intrusive, unwanted thoughts and urges that don't go away. Compulsions are the repetitive behaviors that people perform in a vain attempt to rid themselves of the very uncomfortable feelings that the obsessions cause. Doing compulsions tend to make obsessions worse, especially over the long run. The 4 steps teach a method of reorganizing your thinking in response to unwanted thoughts and urges. They help you to change your behavior to something useful and constructive. Changing your behavior changes your brain. When you change your behavior in constructive ways, the uncomfortable feelings your brain is sending you begin to fade over time. This makes your responses easier to manage and control. And last but not least, it's not how you feel, but what you do that counts. So that was the introduction. In the next video, we're going to read part 1, which is the 4 steps.